1. You're gonna lose weight, 5 kilos per month. 2. You'll sleep more hours than usual.
But, and there's another important principle, it's not the only enemy. We have a world system that's developing in which Russia is a rising potential power, and you're seeing its project in Syria, where it is, along with the Assad regime, carpet bombing people in city after city.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown in over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. We begin with Danni Qappani, trapped under siege with 4,500 others in Moadamiyeh, Syria. About halfway through, you'll hear explosions in the background.
Hello everybody. To live in Moadamiyeh, you have to take into consideration what you may go through. Let me read you this. 1. You're gonna lose weight, 5 kilos per month. 2. You'll sleep more hours than usual. 3. You may have to eat cats and dogs to survive. 4. You would live on illusion of hope. 5. You would get older, a year per month. 6. You would hate the international organizations and the superpowers. 7. You would wish you die every time you hear your kids crying out of pain. 8. You would come up with many creative ideas just to let go the feeling of helplessness. 9. You would ask yourself whether you're a human being. 10. You would drink polluted water. 11. You would suffer from many kinds of phobia. 12. You would suffer from loss of memory. 13. You would suffer from amblyopia. 14. You wouldn't care about time or date. 15. You may die. Are these enough, or should I continue? After considering this, who can take it living under these circumstances? Is it not a war crime to besiege civilians? Is Assad our enemy, or hunger, or both? Are we really in 2016? Last but not least, if you can hear me now, then there are 45,000 of civilians are still breathing to death and starving to life inside the besieged city of Moadamiyeh. Danni Qappani.
In the partial ceasefire that's gone on now in Syria for about a month, it said 250,000 people have gotten at least some UN aid. I wrote to Qappani over the internet and asked him what they've got, and he said recently all they have received is a ration of bread. In New York City a few days ago, a number of Syrians got a message to the United Nations in an innovative way. They got a projector that put a huge image against a blank wall of the UN building.
Be ready in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
A number of good articles about Syria recently, one by Bedura Hassan, a Palestinian woman in Jerusalem. See it in our archive on Syria on thestruggle.org. Now, some of the RPM panel at the Left Forum. This panel is sponsored by RPM, Revive the Peace Movement Network. A number of groups and individuals have been working on this project quietly for a number of months. We only went public last month. We have a statement, which you have, and a website, rpm.world. We hope to be a poll of opinion that will help the left see the challenges and opportunities of 2016 to avoid the conventional, comfortable left cliches and to help unite broad sections of the anti-war movement. We started this effort because we see a movement that is fragmented, unable to mount mass marches or demonstrations, and frozen into thinking that the calendar still reads 2003. Whole sections seem to believe in dark conspiracies. Some see the U.S. and the West behind every war and upheaval, unable to realize that there are other powers out there that can also be imperialistic, cruel, or just plain stupid. Unable to grasp that uprisings can be complicated mixes of revolutionary and reactionary waves. Others have spent years telling Obama that they've got his back, ignoring all the signals that all he wanted was blind upfront support. Worldwide, we have a few problems. Openly racist strongmen winning elections in country after country, tens of millions fleeing devastation, religious-based fanatics of every stripe, climate catastrophe, the sixth mass extinction, and $1 trillion program to make nuclear war more possible. On the other hand, there's been the worldwide Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, hundreds of thousands marching for a livable climate, the revolutions of 2011, and the unexpected outpouring of support by millions in this country for a self-proclaimed socialist and political revolutionary running for president. Unprecedented and terrifying challenges lead to great opportunities, and our panel will explore them today. The first speaker was Ashley Smith, an activist and writer for the International Socialist Organization, which is the largest socialist group in the United States.
I was thinking as I was getting ready for this talk that 13 years ago, we were all marching in New York City, 500,000, 600,000, millions of people all around the world, the largest single day of anti-war activism in human history. And you can't imagine a more different scenario today when you look at the state of the anti-war movement. Back in 2003, the New York Times said there are two superpowers in the world today: the American state and international public opinion. It was always an exaggeration back then, and certainly it would be an exaggeration now, where we have a totally different scenario. It was an exaggeration because really to stop the drive to war would have required a general strike of workers and a soldiers' revolt, because the Bush administration, with the backing of most of the Democratic Party, was determined to go into the Middle East to seize control of the strategic energy reserves there in order to dominate potential rivals in the world system. So the need for an anti-war movement continues today, because that same project is still being exercised by the United States as well as other powers in the Middle East, and what people broadly construe as the Middle East, from Afghanistan all the way down into North Africa. That project is still going on, and we need an anti-war movement. But if you look at the anti-war organizations, they're in a state of disrepair. UFPJ, which was the largest anti-war organization coalition, dissolved into a network. answer, which was in some ways its collaborator and rival, is seriously diminished as a force, and most local anti-war formations have become email lists. They are no longer active, organizing, protesting, demonstrating. And it's not because U.S. imperialism doesn't need to be protested today in the United States. Under Obama, he's done very similar things that Bush has done. You know, there's a united project between the two parties of American capitalism, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And so if you look at what Obama has done, he continued the occupation of Iraq. He escalated the intervention into Afghanistan, unleashed an unrelenting drone war all across the world, is deploying special forces and covert operations to Iraq in particular to take on ISIS, which in many ways is the fantasy enemy, is the perfect alibi for this continuing project of American imperial domination of the Middle East. But it's not only a drive to confront and attempt to control things in the Middle East. The U.S. under Obama is also conducting the pivot to Asia. Obama's about to be scurrying off to Asia to curry favor among various allies to confront, contain, and try and prevent the rise of China as a new imperial power in the world system. And Obama has also launched in what people like Mikhail Gorbachev call a new Cold War against Russia. That is, we're seeing scary inter-imperial dynamics develop in the world system. So we certainly need a vibrant anti-war movement, but we don't have one. And there are some things that have caused this situation that we don't control, that we can't really shift. One of them is that Obama has largely steered away from direct mass deployment of American troops on the ground and instead has turned to drones and special forces. So the immediate impact of large troop deployments, which was one of the key forces that instigated and precipitated the anti-war movement against the Iraq war, has been taken away. So there's an indirect impact, but that indirect impact is massive. So like Bernie Sanders is talking about all sorts of important social reforms. If you wanted to pay for that, you could simply cut the military budget by a significant amount and you could pay for all those domestic social reforms. So the lack of those domestic social reforms is tied to this expenditure of treasure on the continuing imperial project that the U.S. is conducting. So you have that situation where there's not a direct impingement on people's lives. The other thing, as I just referred to it, is that ISIS, which is really a bastard child of the American occupation of Iraq, that is an outgrowth of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which didn't exist in Iraq until the American intervention. So it's a bastard child of the American occupation of the country, is a perfect cover for the U.S. to continue its project in the Middle East. And given the state and ruling class induced paranoia about terrorism and Islam, it's a perfect cover for the continuing operation of the United States. So therefore, because of these conditions, there's relative passive support for the U.S. project, and there's very little mass opposition to it. So those factors we don't really control, but there are factors that we do control that I think have really impinged on the capacity of the anti-war movement to protest, let alone revive itself in this context of an ongoing rapacious imperialism. And I think there are two explanations, two elements of the politics of the anti-war movement that have been an impediment for the core of the anti-war movement attempting to revive protest and struggle in opposition to the empire. And I think there's one wing of the anti-war movement which has a liberal political worldview that thinks the American state can be a force for good in the world, doesn't really question the war on terror as really an imperial project covered up in anti-terrorism rhetoric, and relies on the Democratic Party as a potential ally in the attempt to stop wars and American imperial projects. And I think both of those are fundamentally flawed ideas and have led to disastrous consequences for the anti-war movement. And I think that affected UFPJ in particular, which had been the predominant liberal anti-war coalition. And it came into being not to oppose the war on terror, but to oppose the Iraq war. So it actually kept the question of the war in Afghanistan off the table, which meant that political questioning of the war on terror was never really interrogated. And the assumption was that the American state was doing something good in Afghanistan. It was dealing with al-Qaeda, dealing with the Taliban, fighting jihadists, etc. And that I would argue, is all a cover for American imperial assertion. They don't really oppose jihadist terrorism whatsoever. So UFPJ really came into being to oppose the Iraq War, which was a Republican-led war. Of course, as we know, endorsed by most of the leaders of the Democratic Party itself. But I think the politics of thinking the Democratic Party was somehow a challenge to Bush's war led UFPJ into political problems that undermine its capacity as a movement, beginning with the 2004 election. After we failed to stop the war before it started, with the 2004 election, many of the constituent elements of UFPJ actually backed John Kerry's campaign. Even though John Kerry had voted for the war, and at the Democratic Party National Convention, he went to the podium and saluted, saying he was there to serve his duty for the American empire. So I think this illusion that the Democratic Party was anti-war was explicitly refuted by Kerry himself, and led to a process of demobilization that I think really hit home in 2008 with the election of the supposed anti-war candidate Barack Obama, which, as I've said, he does not deserve the Nobel Prize. Or maybe he does deserve the Nobel Prize, given that Henry Kissinger was a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. It should be called the Nobel War Prize, in fact, not the Nobel Peace Prize. So really, with the election of Obama, UFPJ effectively folded. And at the last convention, there was a debate about which way forward for the anti-war movement. Those of us on the left wing of UFPJ said, we've got to take up the Afghanistan war and oppose that because Obama's going to escalate it. Many of the leaders of UFPJ tried to fend off that attempt to get Afghanistan to be a central part so that you could have continuity of the anti-war movement. Instead, they fought it off and instead said, we need to move into a multi-issue, not necessarily anti-war series of struggles. And that led to the effective dissolution of UFPJ. So that took the liberal anti-war forces off the table, and they were really the predominant ones. In that vacuum, those forces that attempted to continue the anti-war movement were of a mainly left-wing character and got expressed through the anti-war coalition answer, which was really a coalition that was tightly run and controlled by the Workers' World Party and their successor organization after a split in Workers' World called the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Now, to their credit, they opposed all of America's wars. But to their discredit, they took a position of actually supporting other imperial powers and their local dictatorial allies, which I think are fatal flaws in that approach of answer for reasons that I'll lay out. But I think one of their big weaknesses was that they thought you had to have a laundry list of positions on everything under the sun, which actually kept liberal anti-war forces at a distance from answer as a coalition, because we've got to have a united front method in which we agree to a minimum program of anti-war activism to get everybody in the table and then debate and discuss the kind of broader agenda for the left and the anti-imperialist movement. So I think that was a flaw. But I think the deeper argument about the flaws of answer was that it had a politics that were shaped by a Stalinist worldview that Workers' World possesses, which thought during the Cold War that Stalin's Russia, Mao's China were some form of socialist organization, and therefore they took a side in that Cold War supporting the anti-American camp, Russia, China, and their subsidiary allies throughout the world system. And that legacy has shaped its politics of answer and the Party for Socialism and Liberation and Workers' World today, a politics of campism. So the logic of it is my enemy's enemy is my friend. Tragically, my enemy's enemy is not necessarily my friend. It's a fundamentally flawed political position, which I think leads the anti-war movement into profound disrepute. And in the form of the current politics, it's not even supporting a supposed socialist camp. It's supporting openly capitalist powers like China, like Russia, and their subsidiary states who have no pretensions to being socialist, like Assad's regime in Syria, which is a proudly neoliberal capitalist regime that has nothing in common with the socialist tradition. So the logic of campism, the logic of my enemy's enemy is my friend, doesn't even need a socialist cover for its politics to work itself out. And I think this position has led to two disastrous consequences. Number one, it actually aligns the anti-war movement with the autocratic regimes that are oppressing millions of people in the Middle East. So Answer stood with the Egyptian revolution, but not the Syrian revolution. It didn't stand with the uprising of people trying to win democracy and liberation in Syria because it thought that Assad was in the anti-imperialist camp. So they aligned themselves with a brutal dictatorial regime and continue to do so and actually oppose building solidarity with the continuing struggle of the Syrian people for their emancipation from the Assad regime. That position alienates in a fundamental way the genuine revolutionaries that are trying to organize in the Middle East today in very, very difficult positions. It also has a negative impact domestically. We're not going to win a new generation of radicalizing people to sign up with an anti-war movement that supports dictators who are massacring their people. It will actually push them away from the anti-war movement and make them prey to liberal pro-imperialist arguments that the U.S. can somehow play a humanitarian role in the crises in the Middle East. So it not only has a disastrous implication in the Middle East, it has a domestic disastrous implications. So I'll just conclude by laying out what I think are going to be the key elements for an actual process of reviving the anti-war movement today. And really they're principles, because we can't snap our fingers and suddenly induce an anti-war movement to come into being for the objective reasons that we don't control that I described earlier. Number one, we have to be independent from both capitalist parties in the United States. Both the Democratic Party, which has blood in its hands for the whole 20th century. It started most of the American wars and occupations of the 20th century. It is not an alternative to the Republican Party, as I think the Obama administration has proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. We should also have no illusions in the capacity of the American state to deliver liberation anywhere in the world for any oppressed people. Martin Luther King got it right in the 1960s when he described the American state as the greatest purveyor of violence in our world today. So you can't expect a shark to become a vegetarian. It's not going to suddenly decide that it's going to have a different dietary habit. It's a shark, and we should understand it as such. That means we have to oppose American imperialism in all its guises, whether it's war, whether it's sanctions, whether it's indirect manipulations of subsidiary forces all around the world. That is, the slogan is correct. The main enemy of the people in the world is the U.S. state, and it's the main enemy of people in the United States as well. When you think about the diversion of nearly 50% of the American federal budget into war-making in the world system. But, and there's another important principle, it's not the only enemy. We have a world system that's developing in which Russia is a rising potential power. And you're seeing its project in Syria, where it is, along with the Assad regime, carpet bombing people in city after city. The siege of Aleppo, the strangulation and massacres of scores and hundreds and thousands of people and their displacement. But it's not only Russia, China as well. So while we oppose the American imperial project, we also, if we're going to be principled anti-war activists, we have to oppose the imperial project of its contending powers, Russia and China. And instead of falling for the logic of campism, we should stand with the liberation struggle of people in the world, regardless of which camp they're in. So we stand with the Syrian revolution and the Egyptian revolution. We have to have both things if we're going to be principled in rebuilding the anti-war movement. And really, their liberation is bound up with our liberation. That is, by building international solidarity, we show that people in the Middle East and people in other sections of the world have allies that have their back in their struggle, and they will have our back in our struggle. And so it's really the ABCs of international solidarity. So these are, I think, the basic principles that we have to go through the process of rebuilding the anti-war movement. But as I said, it's not going to be a snap-your-fingers situation. We are going to have to argue this through against the liberal dead end, as well as this so-called anti-imperialist left dead end, which is actually pro-imperialist, pro-war left that's on the side of the counter-revolution. Both of those things have led the anti-war movement to a principled cul-de-sac. We need to start building a genuine alternative. That's what the Revive the anti-war movement is really all about.
Famed activist Medea Benjamin spoke later in the panel. But she gave a chance to a UFPJ leader who was in the audience to answer Ashley, so I'll play that section now.
But I also want to disagree a little bit more with the premise and maybe with what Ashley said, because I want to pay tribute to other coalitions that have come before and are still trying to do the work of reviving. And one of those is United for Peace and Justice. And I see George Martin here, who's done so much work on that. And I wondered if I could just give you a moment to clarify what you think happened to
Well,
UFPJ.
thank you, sir. Because UFPJ never had large donors. It was from us, 25 bucks and 10 bucks at a time. You know, the traditional disarmament movement didn't fund us in the beginning. It was the environmental movement that threw some money in to get us going. Okay, that's the reality. So with Obama's initial campaign, it took workers and it took money away from the peace movement. Not only UFPJ, AFSC had to sell half their buildings. Organizations throughout this country downsized. We went from 15 staff to 1. And it was a very hurting thing. And we realized that. And so there was a division within UFPJ. Should we continue doing what we're doing? Or should we step aside and let a new butterfly evolve that can better deal with this democratic militarism in the direction at that point in time? You know, as a black man, I'm proud we have a black president, but I was never in support of him because I knew in Chicago that the Crown family, General Dynamics, had pushed his war chest and got him to D.C. So I was never there with that. But at the same time, I always go with my friends, and my friends who are supporting Bernie, I say, go with your hope. You know, but let's talk later. And now's the time to start that talk. But so in terms of what happened with UFPJ, there was that division. And many of us were of the ill to say, let's start all over again. We need a different structure. Well, the structure continued, and I support that. I'm not as active as I used to be. And I'll get into some other things later on, but I think it's important to clarify that point. And thank you, Medea.
So thank you. And we have people here who represent the oldest peace movement in the United States, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and I want to give a shout out to them. I think, Ashley, you did a great job at putting forth some reasons for the fall in the peace movement. There were others. The women's movement. The women's movement, for the most part, the establishment women's movement supported the invasion of Afghanistan and continued to support U.S. presence in Afghanistan. And that made it very difficult for groups, especially groups like Code Pink, that were trying to reach out and form a broader women's movement against the war. There were all kinds of reasons that led us into where we are today. And I would add another one, which is that we tend to eat each other up. We tend to say that we're not as radical as the next one, that if we supported Al Gore, we were the worst people in the world, that if we vote for Hillary Clinton, we are monsters, that if we think that, I mean, you can go on and on into the ways that we really destroy each other. And it doesn't make it very fun. It doesn't make it very inviting. It doesn't say to the enthusiastic young people like Dan, come on into this movement. It's a great big tent. And we got to stop doing that. So
More RPM video coming. You can see all of it right now. Go to rpm.world. If you watch Democracy Now! Recently, you've seen several segments about the fight against methane pipelines, especially one near the Indian Point nuclear power plant. When this first started, people said the cause was hopeless, but now it's a major campaign, and even the governor of New York has lent his weight against the pipeline near Indian Point. Here's an interview I did in Buchanan on the Hudson River with Paul Blanche, a nuclear expert, last July.
This basically shows the new path of the 42-inch gas line going out here. The yellow line are the existing gas lines crossing Indian Point, and this will be the connection point for the two lines. These lines right here show different radii from, one could postulate an explosion anywhere along this line or anywhere along this line. If there's an explosion in the existing line, it's about 480 feet from the Indian Point Unit 3 structure, which is located right here. If we postulate an explosion in here, which is 105 to 115 feet from these vital structures, this being the diesel generator fuel oil tank and the switch yard. The NRC admits that if we have a rupture in this area, that these two components, the gas turbine fuel oil tank and the switch yard, will essentially be wiped out by the radiant energy in the blast. Well, that was my main concern, because in their energy analysis they said they could terminate the gas flow in 3 minutes, and now we find NRC documents that are based on actual studies by Oak Ridge National Lab that says that if a line blows up, you're probably not going to detect it, know about it, unless there's visual confirmation, probably for hours. And then once you do visually confirm it, it's going to take hours to actually terminate the gas flow. By that time, after hours, you've released more energy than many nuclear bombs, small nuclear bombs. And this gas, coming out around here, down the road, 100 yards, can drift anywhere, whether it's exploded gas or whether it's unexploded gas. But the radiant heat, and if you look over here, you can see the switch yard, and that switch yard controls all the power going in and coming out. And the NRC itself acknowledges that the switch yard with a gas explosion would actually be rendered inoperable. That means they got no power coming into the site. The plants obviously would trip, but concurrent with that, we see over here the 250,000 gallon gas tank, which supplies emergency power to the diesel generators. So after a while, we wouldn't have any power at all to the plant after many hours, because both the tank and the switch yard, all AC power, would eventually be lost, and may wind up with a situation that actually caused Fukushima, and that was loss of power. They didn't have any way to power up the pumps to cool the reactors, and that resulted in the meltdown.
There seemed to be a lot of city, state officials at the meeting. Were you encouraged by their interest?
I was very encouraged. I mean, we had Schumer's office represented, we had Gillibrand's office represented, we had Lowy, we had a few other state senators, we had Assemblywoman Galiff. We have quite a bit of political attention. I was very pleased that people are now seeing that there are many unanswered questions about the safety of Indian Point with respect to the gas lines.
Maybe the experts are right, and the chances of anything terribly bad happening at Indian Point are really, really remote. But what if the worst does happen? Trillions of dollars of damage? 20 million people in the path of a radioactive plume? Why would anything explosive be allowed within miles of a nuclear power plant? Mad recklessness. Brought to you by corporate America. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.